So if 1971 was almost a taking of the brakes off regional interstate power, then the Iranian Revolution of 1979 led to a new radical foreign policy emanating from Tehran. This was married with a revolutionary message, with a commitment to funding Shia organizations across the Arab side of the Gulf, encouraging them to rise up, to mobilize, to place pressure on the existing status quo and the rulers of the Arab side of the Gulf. So if we have 71 and 79 as these two big watershed moments, the autonomy of the states of the Gulf as the British leave, and then a radical foreign policy encouraging sub-state actors, I would argue we bring these together in 2003 with the removal of Saddam Hussein that has brought together these dynamics and exacerbated and driven them forward. And that's driven three separate dynamics, three separate regional dynamics that are destabilizing the area. Firstly, the Iraqi elections of 2005 and 2010, and we can say with almost certain 2014, saw the Shia and Kurdish populations in the country voting for political parties that deliberately and explicitly heralded them, mobilized them, asked them to vote for them in terms of their Shia and Kurdish sub-state identities. So what we have is those elections bringing in overt sectarian political mobilization to the Gulf region. The Iraqi governments that were then formed in the aftermath of 2005 and in the aftermath of 2010 were dominated by Shia politicians that claimed to be representing the Shia population of Iraq specifically because of their religious identity. Because of this, Iraqi nationalism then became infused with a strong, specifically Shia identity, which by its very nature excluded those Iraqis who could not empathize with it. Broadly, the Sunni, the secular, or the Kurdish sections of the populations. The elections themselves and the governments of national unity that were built in their aftermath organized Iraqi politics in a specifically and overtly sectarian way, giving out cabinet posts, jobs in the ministries, and government funding along sub-state communal lines. Basically, the votes that were delivered in sectarian terms to sectarian politicians were rewarded by cabinet positions that then allowed those politicians to give state resources to the people that had voted for them or the party faction members that they brought into the ministries with them. So basically, regime change in Iraq has promoted and empowered an idea of national politics across the region, but one that is not shaped by national identities, but sub-state religious identities, not unitary, inclusive national identities. I think that's the first big genie let out of the bottle by the Iraq regime change in 2003. Secondly, although greatly weakened by the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq war and the devastating sanctions that followed the 1991 invasion of Kuwait, Iraq before 2003 still remained a balancer in regional politics, acting as a buffer to and a brake on Iranian power projection into the Gulf region. With Saddam Hussein removed and the Iraqi armed forces destroyed after 2003, the balance of power in the Gulf was transformed, and that transformation was to Iran's benefit. Iran was now largely unrestrained in its ability to project power into Iraq, but also beyond Iraq into the wider Gulf region. The collapse of the Iraqi state after 2003 was followed by the 2 terms of the Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad from 2005 to 2013. He, empowered by rising oil prices and with what we assume was then at least the blessing of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, adopted a strident, aggressive, and to be frank, jingoistic tone towards the Arab Gulf states that stood in stark contrast to the previously conciliatory approach of Presidents Rafsanjani and Khatami. Finally, the increased instability in the Gulf region has been caused by the institutional and military collapse of the Iraqi state itself. The looting of the Iraqi government after American troops reached Baghdad in 2003 was exacerbated and accelerated by the disbanding of the Iraqi army and security forces by the US in 2003. What we had from 2003, we can pick a date, but it's probably 2007-8, was the almost complete collapse of the Iraqi state. That threw open the territory of Iraq to infiltration, to power projection by Iraq's more coherent and powerful neighbours. It also empowered indigenous sub-state, what we could call coercive entrepreneurs, who formed militias and drove Iraq into the civil war that dominated it to at least 2007. So it's my claim that these three interlocking dynamics, certainly present in the Gulf before 2003, but exacerbated and driven forward after 2003, have placed the region in what we could call a new Cold War. A new regional Cold War with the Arab states of the Gulf sometimes aligned with Turkey on one side and Iran on the other. And we can pick out key trends of this Cold War emanating from Iraq. Iraqi politics increasingly mobilized around the encouragement of sectarian identity. That's been exported. Certainly, Shia communities in the Gulf, encouraged by Iranian advice and finance, but also encouraged by the Iraqi example of a politics specifically driven by communal identity, not national inclusion. And then finally, the collapse of the Iraqi state, providing both a platform from which militias, ungoverned political forces can use violence, but also showing that within a weak state, external powers can fruitfully fight over the spoils, encouraging their players, buying people to do their bidding and to pursue this Cold War. So basically I'm saying that Iraq as a battleground for regional states, as a state currently dominated as a country currently dominated by a very weak institutional state, but also with its politics animated by the overt attempt to maximize sectarian identity, has become the font of this regional Cold War. Now, against that rather bleak picture, let's move towards looking at the Iraqi elections that will take place on April the 30th. How will these elections affect this bleak situation? Now, on the face of it, these elections look very different to the ones held in 2010 and extremely different to the ones held in the two sets of elections held in 2005. In 2010, two coalitions, the State of Law and the National Alliance, competed with each other for the Shia votes. Iraqi, a broadly secular coalition led by the former Prime Minister Ayad Alawi, attempted to run a campaign that sought to mobilize Iraqis across the Iraqi nation on a national policy-orientated issues. Today, all of those political movements have fractured. There are now three political parties or three political groupings competing with each other for the Shia vote. Firstly, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's State of Law, then the Ahrar group run by Muqtada al-Sadr, and the Citizens Bloc run by Amir Hakim and his party, the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq. Now, although Sadr clearly targets a different section of the Shia population, his support is anchored into the urban, poor and unemployed. The three-way fight between Sadr, Maliki and Hakim is clearly going to split the Shia vote. The Iraqi coalition has simply fractured. I think from its triumph in 2010 until today, we've seen the disintegration of what was a particularly successful vote-getting machine. The three new parties have taken over from the Iraqi coalition or stepped out of it, and they've largely dropped the aspiration to run a national, secular, policy-based campaign. Salah Mutlaq, the Deputy Prime Minister, who is sometimes aligned and sometimes against Nouri al-Maliki, is running the Arabiya group. Osama Najafi, at the moment the Speaker of the Parliament, and probably the most senior Sunni Muslim politician left in Iraq, which must make him feel very uneasy given what's happened to Tariq al-Hashimi and Rafi al-Asawi, is leading the United Coalition. And finally, Ayad Alawi is working with the rump, what's left of what was Iraqia and the Wataniya coalition. The Iraqi state is still very weak. It's dominated by corruption. It's unable to deliver services, water, electricity, or indeed law and order on a reliable basis to its population. However, against that background of corruption, state failure, and violence, the campaign to date in Baghdad, in Basra, in Mosul, has not been dominated by the failures of the Iraqi ruling class or a policy manifesto that would deliver Iraq to a better, more stable future, but by two issues. Firstly, the threat posed by the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant and how to deal with it. And secondly, the threat posed by Nouri al-Maliki to Iraq's continuing democracy. These two twin issues, I would argue, have allowed the main parties, the main national politicians, and especially the Prime Minister himself, Nouri al-Maliki, to use sectarian rhetoric as their main vehicle for mobilizing and solidifying their voting blocs. So I think far from putting the genie back into the bottle, as it were, far from moving Iraq to an equal citizenship or an electoral campaign based on bread and butter issues, nearly all the politicians have indulged in that age-old favorite sectarian rhetoric. Now, the Iraqi Council of Representatives, the parliament, has 328 seats, with 165 seats needed for a majority. Nouri al-Maliki is the incumbent, the two-term prime minister, clearly has the most to lose. Maliki only got 89 seats in 2010, but it's highly unlikely he'll get anywhere close to the 165 seats needed for an outright majority. Maliki, during the election campaign, however, has committed his coalition to moving towards an even more sectarian platform, a majoritarian government which would include only Shia parties, thus excluding the Kurdish and the Sunni parties and reducing them to the role of hopefully loyal opposition in parliament, not giving them cabinet seats. Now, I would argue this majoritarian platform conforms to a strategy Maliki has been following since the beginning of his second term in 2010. He has sought to increase his own power and break the influence of Ayad Alawi's Iraqi and drive them from cabinet. He's encouraged parliamentary divisions within Iraqi and the fracturing of Iraqi into these three competing political blocs indicates the success he's had in that. As we know, he used allegations of terrorism to drive the former vice president, Tariq al-Hashimi, from the government and then from the country in December 2011. In December 2012, he did something very similar to the Iraqi Minister of Finance, Rafi al-Asawi, who was accused of terrorism and then subsequently driven from the cabinet. Now the allegations against Asawi triggered demonstrations across the Sunni majority areas of the northwest of Iraq, focused on the provincial capital of Anbar, Ramadi. From December 2012 to April 2013, tens of thousands of ordinary Iraqis who were Sunni demonstrated in Anbar's two biggest cities, Fallujah and Ramadi. Protests quickly spread into neighbouring provinces of Diyala and Nineveh. Demonstrators blocked the main highways to both Jordan and Syria. Eventually, the Iraqi army was brought in to break up the demonstrations, with the death of people in April 2013 and then finally the closing down of the sole remaining protest camp in Ramadi in December and January 2013 and 2014. I think it's against this background that we've seen a steady rise in violence across Iraq. In 2013, more than 8,800 people were killed in violence. That's the highest toll since the end of the civil war in 2008. This year, nearly 600 Iraqis were killed in March and 700 were killed in January and February. What I would argue is the forcible exclusion of senior Sunni politicians from the government and the violent suppression of the protest this caused has deeply alienated the Sunni community, who've seen nothing for the mass votes they delivered to the ballot box in March 2010. They were given 91 seats, the largest of all the coalitions running in that 2010 elections, but then subsequently saw their key politicians driven from government, driven from cabinet on what I believe were trumped-up charges of terrorism. The fracturing of the parties seeking to mobilize the Sunni vote and the alienation of the Sunni population from the political process in Iraq will probably lead to a low electoral turnout at the end of the month, with Sunnis across the areas that the majority is in simply sitting on their hands and not going to vote. One, because it's too violent, but two, because they got precious little for their turning out to vote in 2010. This leaves the three Kurdish parties, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, and the Guran movement, as the possible major break on Nouri al-Maliki's ambitions to retain the premiership. However, the president of the Kurdish region, Masoud Barzani, stated in Hayat recently that he feels the political process has reached a dead end, and he sees no hope for democracy if Maliki returns to power. He said, quote, Kurds may resort to a referendum to redefine the relations between Baghdad and Erbil and might take other options. Yet again, Barzani is hinting that if they don't get the right result in Baghdad, they'll push for secession. Now, one positive note, I was scratching my head trying to think what positive note I could bring to you. One positive note is I don't know the outcome of the Iraqi elections. Unless you've got a particularly effective crystal ball, neither do you. But more impressively still, neither does the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki. He allegedly told Barack Obama on his last visit to Washington that if he didn't get 100 seats, he'd resign. I think that's a possibility. He may have told Barack Obama that, but I don't believe that he would, and neither I suspect does Barack Obama. But the point being that the electoral process is not ridden with enough fraud or enough central control for Maliki to fix it. The best suggested estimates would indicate that if Maliki gets the same or a larger number of votes, 89 through the 90s, he will be in a dominant position to form a coalition government. Anything above 90, heading towards the hundreds, he will be in a very good position. If you travel through Baghdad at the moment and speak to people like Amir Hakim, what you find is politicians recognizing that Maliki probably will be in a dominant position and positioning themselves to get cabinet posts on the basis of that. The Supreme Council have indicated that it would like the service ministries as their price for allowing Maliki a second term. What is a third term, sorry? What does this mean? What does such an outcome mean for Iraqi politics going forward? I would argue that Maliki has very consciously and tactically exacerbated, driven out of power the key Sunni politicians and exacerbated sectarian tensions to solidify what matters to him, his sheer vote base in the south. The seizing of the temporary seizing of Ramadi, but the more long-term seizing of Fallujah in December 2013, January 2014, is clearly and very worryingly indicative of the weakness of the Iraqi armed forces. Nearly a million men under arms couldn't retake those cities, but I suspect it's also been useful to the Prime Minister, who can now pose as a strong man, the only man that can vanish the threat posed by the Islamic State of the Iraq and Levant, the man who needs to be voted for, or even greater chaos will ensue. If that happens, if Maliki turns out and the state of law turns out to have the largest slab of votes going forward, I think we see more of the same. I think him working hard to solidify his vote banks in the south by playing the sectarian card, him failing even though he's got increasing wealth from the export of oil, 90% of all oil revenue, of all state government revenue coming from the export of oil, and that export slowly increasing. But that money, I don't think, will go to building institutions that tap each member of society in an equal way. I think that money will go to greater elite solidification, greater corruption, and more weaponry for the armed services. Which leaves us, in the last few minutes, to ask, where does this leave Iraq and where does this leave the region? I think the very worrying insight that I want to give you tonight is that this new regional Cold War that pits the Arab side of the Gulf against Iran, that uses sectarian rhetoric as a tool for pursuing state interests, finds as its main target weak states across the region. Most obviously Iraq and Syria, but also those failings, the institutional oversights, the problems of governments on this side of the Gulf and in the wider Middle East. If we look at how Iraq has been tapped, we find Maliki himself recognizing in March 2014 the permeability of Iraq's borders, but rather intriguingly blaming Saudi Arabia and Qatar as the major sinners. He says sectarians with ties to foreign agendas, with Saudi Arabia and Qatari incitement have been driving this country into violence. Quote, they are attacking Iraq through Syria in a direct way, and they announced the war on Iraq as they announced it on Syria, and unfortunately it is on a sectarian basis. These two countries are primarily responsible for the sectarian and terrorist and security crisis of Iraq. I would profoundly disagree with Nouri al-Maliki on that statement. I would say that his own policies are primarily responsible, but I would say the two most influential states in interfering in Iraq at the moment are firstly Iran and secondly Turkey. It is estimated in the run-up to the 2010 elections that Iran supported Iraqi parties to the tune of between $100 and $200 million. Intriguingly, I think Iran's policy towards Iraq has been to keep the country as weak as possible, so the Hausa of Najaf doesn't challenge Qom as to take up its traditional historical place as the center of Shia learning and the center of Shia Islam. And in doing so, it's played off key Iraqi politicians amongst each other through targeted funding. It was quite fascinating going into the 2010 elections that Nouri al-Maliki wasn't Iran's first choice. But with this massive outpouring of the Iraqi vote, Iran quickly swung behind Maliki and forced his great enemy, Muqtada al-Sadr, to use his votes in parliament to back Maliki for prime minister. From then on, Iran has called in those debts from Maliki, getting him to allow Iraqi territory to be used to transship weapons and supplies to Iran's allies in Damascus, and also encouraging militias, Asib al-Haq most primarily, and the Sadrists as well, to go and fight in support of Assad in Syria. On the other side of the new Cold War, we have Turkey, which is probably the second most influential power in Iraq. They supported Ayad Alawi in the 2010 elections unsuccessfully, and they acted as a channel for Saudi money. But as Nouri al-Maliki solidified his second term in government, they then swung behind the Kurdish regional government's bid for greater financial independence to try and undermine Nouri al-Maliki and put pressure on him. This reached its peak in January 2014, when the Kurdish regional government announced that it had begun to pipe oil through a pipeline to Turkey, independent of Baghdad's geographical control. This is a massive watershed potentially for the Kurdish regional government, because it allows it to independently export its oil and away from Baghdad oversight, away from Iraqi control, and has caused a hell of a fight between Baghdad and Iraq. Now, against that background, we see that the majority of that oil has not been sold, still sitting in storage in Ceyhan. And I would read that as Turkey's rather late in the day realization that the destabilising of Iraq's territorial integrity may well weaken Iran in the region, but would also ultimately come back to undermine Turkey's own security and exacerbate, even given the ongoing talks with the PKK, exacerbate Turkey's own Kurdish problem. So to conclude, where do we stand in the region today? I think rather depressingly, Iraq stands as an example of a very potentially bleak regional future. That Iraq has become a cockpit, a boxing ring for larger states within the region to use proxies, to encourage sectarian ideology, to undermine the Iraqi state in the name of a larger regional conflagration, or rather a larger regional conflict. That has seen Iraq go into civil war once, from 2004 to 2008, and it's my prediction it will see Iraq go into civil war again in the aftermath of these 2014 elections. That contagion, both Iraq and Syria, in the midst of a civil war justified increasingly in sectarian terms, cannot but spread similar ideological dynamics, similar problems further down the Gulf. And I think it's that worry that states that are not as strong as they could be, that haven't got an inclusive citizenship, that aren't seen to be delivering resources equally to their populations, irrespective of their religious beliefs, are vulnerable to this new Cold War and will see increasing instability along the lines, if not as extreme, as Iraq and Syria. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Toby. Before we open up to the floor, I wonder, Andrew, if you can just turn off the AC, if it's on. Because despite the fact my sunburned forehead is probably radiating 3,000 watts of heat, I'm quite cold up here, so thanks. Thanks, Toby, for a typically optimistic presentation.
Mr. Happy.
Your hallmark, of course. Before we open for questions, I've got a couple of comments, or one comment and a question. One, first of all, a clarification. And I'm not quite sure if this is how you meant it, but when you were talking about the seizure of Fallujah, you said that it was retrospectively strategically beneficial for Maliki to have the ISIL having taken possession of the city. You're not suggesting, presumably, that this was his strategy, or this will be a future strategy, or maybe you are. But then I've got a question as well on how this political instability and insecurity translates into real life on the ground. And there's an individual I can see at the back of the room here might be able to give us an idea maybe of some of the development that is taking place on the ground in Iraq economically. But I'd be interested to know if you have a perspective on that as well. We hear in Benghazi, for example, which is still racked with violence, that it is economically booming and there's a lot of investment flooding in. And again, I've read similar reports in Iraq. So my question is, despite the fact that the country is completely hamstrung politically, is it possible that still money from the region or internationally, and again maybe from the Far East, is able to drag Iraq up from the ground? And whether, despite the political instability and complete insecurity and the ongoing violence, whether there's a chance that the economy can catch up with that and maybe even overtake it. And maybe we've reached a new status quo where this is the norm. Like, for example, we might even see in Lebanon, which has experienced strife for decades now, but still economically is arguably still a powerhouse. So that would be my question to you. While you ponder those, maybe We can take a couple more from the floor, Mansour.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. I just have
Oh, sorry, Mansour, just wait for the mic. You can just give your name, please, as well.
Mansour Al-Jamri, Al-Wasat newspaper, Bahrain. Two things, basically. When you talked about the power projection by Iran into Iraq using sectarian politics, I just had the feeling of you downplayed the role of others who play Sunni politics as well, namely in the Gulf countries are playing. Whether you have downplayed it or eliminated it from the talk. There is a lot of support for ISIS and others and so on. So everybody is playing dirty politics in Iraq at the moment. Secondly, with regard to this point, actually, the generalization that Iran is funding Shia parties across the Arab world, while you're talking in Bahrain and there's a lot of, there's a crisis here, it might be just that it justifies the discourse of the government here, which says that we do not want to recognize the demands of the population because majority Shias and they are funded by Iran. So basically you might not have meant it, but the place where you're talking about it is the other sensitive question. So that's question about the power politics, and the other one is the U.S. role, that how influential is the U.S. now in the Iraqi politics. Thank you very much.
One more. Do you want to take those two?
Yeah, should I take those first?
Okay.
Yeah. So I've got 4 questions, I think, 2 or 3 from you and 2 or 3 from Mark. The first point of clarification on Fallujah is a fascinating one. So to know the background, it's a very good strategic comment published by the IISS recently on this. The Iraqi army were in mid to late December were campaigning along the Syrian border in the far west of Anbar. And they were doing so to try and seal the border from cross-state infiltration of the Islamic State and Iraqi Levant, radical Islamist fighters, to try and stop the contagion coming down. I think in a dreadful act of a failure of intelligence, but also, to be frank, an indication of how good the Islamic State is, there was a very well-planned ambush that took out 4 senior members of the Iraqi army in one attack. That forced Maliki to move troops up into Anbar, but as he did so, he couldn't quite resist deploying those troops to suppress the remaining protest camp in Ramadi. That triggered what I think would be fair to say is an urban popular uprising, which Maliki said, all right, I'll pull the Iraqi armed forces out of the urban conurbations of Fallujah and Ramadi to let this time to calm down. The Islamic State then seized both Ramadi and Fallujah using, I think it's 60 heavily armed cars into the center of Fallujah. At that stage, you have a standoff. Ramadi, I think, was brought under a rough and ready control by the Iraqi army fairly quickly after that. Fallujah hadn't been. Now, am I saying Maliki planned that? No, I'm not. But what I am saying is that the crisis allowed him to pose as a strong man, and the crisis wasn't solved, and to date still isn't solved. I mean, Iraq has nearly 1 million men under arms. It could have taken back Fallujah, and this decision wasn't. So I think this isn't a long-term conspiracy theory, but I think it is the exacerbation of sectarian tensions as undoubted electoral strategy. On the financing, you're right. On the basis that Iraq oil exports are finally going up, Iraq has a wonderful potential to export more and more, especially with the renegotiations of the early contracts signed between international oil companies and Iraq, which are ongoing. That said, and this is kind of classic example of development economics, what you need to make sure that oil money can benefit the population as a whole and drive what would be a rentier economy, but drive it on a sustainable basis. You need coherent state institutions to diffuse the money in a strategically, economically sustainable, beneficial way across society. In Iraq, those institutions don't exist, and corruption is rampant. So what we could be seeing, to quote someone else, is almost like a Nigeria on steroids, where vast amounts of oil are coming into the country. The population, especially in the south, recognize that the soil beneath their feet is delivering untold wealth, but not to them, to a corrupt, sclerotic ruling elite. And that produces greater resentment, as it has in Nigeria. greater violence and greater demands for secession. I think that's the issue I'm playing with. Now, to come specifically and in detail to your two questions, the reason I left out Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states is I don't think their official ability, the state capacity to project power into Iraq is that great. Now, if we go up into Anbar and we look at those demonstrations after the arrest of Rafi al-Asawi, we see certainly should we say, external investment in those demonstrations by the fact that they were well funded with food and water and everything. But I don't see that money coming directly from Gulf states. Now, undoubtedly, and this is the great conundrum about radical Islam and the Islamic State's violence in Iraq and Syria, you have private sources and possibly even parastate sources funding those. But that route or rat run of money is much more effective and much more clearly identifiable in Syria than it is in Iraq. I don't think Gulf state money plays in anything comparable a role to active Turkish state interference. Now, the point you make about the ramifications of exacerbating Iranian influence amongst Shia groups in the region is very well taken. And I try to deal with that with my concluding remarks in the talk, that if you look at the mobilization of groupings within the Gulf that happen to be majority Shia, most often what's happening is protests against valid demands for a more equitable distribution of state resources, undoubtedly. Now put that to one side and say, but there is also undoubted and often not successful evidence of Iran seeking either to encourage that, take over those movements, or turn them in different directions. So what we need to do, and you're quite right in pulling me up on that, is undoubtedly flag Iranian influence, but say quite often it's been unsuccessful, and quite often those political movements have disavowed and stepped away from that. But those and to say that those political movements are primarily nationalist in focus and intent, and primarily demanding more equitable distribution of resources. Both of those, I think, are very true, and that's the question. The US. Now, this, yeah, exactly. This gets me on my favourite hobby horse. I think for very good reason, and I think very successfully in terms of domestic politics, President Obama, when he was candidate Obama, ran his presidential election on an unambiguous, timetabled response to pull troops out. Fair enough. And I would have said at the time, and I would say now, that the United States being central to the huge problems that today dominate Iraq was probably not going to be in for the solution. Now, you know as well as I do, in Washington, there's a huge debate about whether Obama sold Iraq out, whether he's responsible. Let's put blame where blame is due. The Status of Forces Agreement, the timetable of the withdrawal of American troops in Iraq was signed by George Bush, not by Barack Obama. And very late in the day, and rather diplomatically and competently, I would add, Obama tried to negotiate a caveat to the Status of Forces Agreement, which would have kept some troops in Iraq. Would those troops have made much difference? I don't think so. They would have been to do with force protection around trainers. But Obama tried to do that. So I think, yes, you have a dual Republican and Democratic legacy for the timetable of troops coming out of Iraq. As soon as they left, the Iraqi government started to manipulate the life support systems of the American embassy in Baghdad. Visas were denied. The access of especially the military, but also the intelligence staff within the embassy to the Iraqi government was radically restricted. And I think the message being sent to Washington was clear. You need a foreign policy success story here, and we're happy with that, but we will limit your influence and your access and your ability to shape the ground. And if you push against that limits, we will constrict it even further. So I think American influence in Iraq is negligible. And I say that rather strong word advisedly. I think you could argue, up until very recently, I think Vice President Joseph Biden is one of the main culprits here, that there was a deliberate attempt to downplay the instability and problems in Iraq. I think that's now over. I think possibly because it's the second term of the Obama presidency, possibly because things are so bad in Iraq. We've seen a recognition of the problems within the country, But with so little influence, what can the Americans do? And with such a tainted legacy because of 2003 onwards, I don't think they have the ability to shape the ground, even if they wanted to. And I don't think there's a great desire to do that either.
We have two more questions. So, lady at the front here, and then Jocelyn at the back there.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Lala from the GDN. I thought that you made some very interesting points, but I also wanted to sort of bring it back a little bit to the Middle East and Bahrain in particular. Your comment about the American influence in Iraq being negligible, I think is, I mean, I'm sure you're far more knowledgeable than me, but I also think it's a little laughable to think that just because the country isn't doing anything overtly, that they're not doing anything underground. My question is, what do you think the importance of the expansion of the US and the UK bases in Bahrain have on the politics within the Middle East and in Iraq in particular? And you speak about a civil war imminent in Iraq, and I was wondering, what do you think, again, the domino effect of that would be on the rest of the Gulf? And finally, you were talking about the sectarian split, and I do agree that obviously the politicians do use a lot of sectarian rhetoric, but in the ground in Iraq itself, when you speak to the majority of people, they don't hold much credence to the sectarian split so much as hate splinter groups such as Al-Qaeda and for some people Muqtada Sadr in terms of what they're doing to tear apart Iraqi politics. So how important do you think the sectarian split is within the country rather than just as a rhetoric used in politics?
Right.
Tell those now.
Yeah, oh, do you want me to?
No, I won't tell those now.
I think my experience of studying Iraq and working in Iraq and being in Iraq from 2003 onwards was a revelation to me about US influence. I think it's the temptation, I'd indulge in it myself, is to assume the US as the world's sole remaining superpower has tentacles and the capacity to influence. And when you get up close to a specific state and look, it's rather shocking that they don't. And I think the history of the US in Iraq from 2003 to 2011 is not only of rank incompetence, but it's also of intelligence failure, of lack of capacity of turning policy desires into policy actions that have meaningful success on the ground, with possibly the one exception of the surge in 2007-8, and that's legacy, I think, is running out quickly as well. When you talk about covert action, yeah, you could quite rightly point to the CIA station in Baghdad and say it's meant to be one of the largest in the world. But then you could also point to the fact that the Iraqi security services have frequently and recently arrested plainclothes Americans without permission to be where they should be and taken them back to the embassy and had them deported. I don't think the US has the covert means in Iraq to do much at all. I think it's highly constrained and it has great problems there. And I can't think of evidence or examples of it having covert success, unless the current mess that Iraq is in is what the Americans want, in which case they're Machiavellian geniuses, but I don't think that's the case. What does the expansion of the US and British bases in Bahrain say? I would say that it's London and Washington have clearly prioritized what they see as their own strategic concerns in the region over any of the concerns they may or may not have for the way Bahraini politics is going. Now, you could tear your hair out and say that's outrageous, why do they care? Or you could look back to the post-2003 period where we had a president in George Bush who clearly and very seriously took democratization and was committed to democratization in Iraq, tried somewhat ham-fistedly in Egypt, and failed in both cases. It was the Arab Spring, as I read it, where it was successful, and those successes are shrinking probably solely down to Tunisia, was about people power. Ordinary Tunisians, and in Tahrir in Egypt, ordinary Egyptians fronting down the power of sclerotic and corrupt states and saying not enough. The idea that somehow the US should do it for Tunisians or Egyptians, I think, is abdicating the power of Egyptians or Tunisians to do it. So in that case, although I can see the tension between the warm words and empty commitments to democratization, to stability, to human rights, to rule of law, against the strategic positioning. The fact that Britain and the United States seem to have prioritized their strategic concerns, although disturbing, is explainable. On the ground in Iraq, well, yes, I can give you evidence from every opinion poll that I've read that says Iraq is, at the height of the civil war in 2006, by overall majority, backed a strong Iraqi state and said their primary identity was Iraqi nationalist and Islamic. No hint of that. But then you look at the voting patterns, for example, of Iraqis. The Sadrists at the last election in 2010 secured the largest single block of any parliamentarians, 40 seats. And the Sadrists had, from 2004 to 2008, were the key players in an incredibly vicious civil war. So either the people who voted for the Sadrists voted for them in spite of their sectarian record of bloodshed, or voted for them because of it. I doubt it's the second, but I think there are clearly sectarian mobilizations. Now, again, you're right that politicians, primarily amongst them Noor al-Maliki, indulged in what graphic and destabilizing sectarian rhetoric in their election campaigns. Opinion polls would suggest, and I suspect the outcome of this election will prove, that Noor al-Maliki is probably the most popular politician in Iraq. He gained nearly 1 million individual votes in Baghdad in 2010 and will come close to it. So I think there is a disconnect, but, which there probably is in all of us, between the Iraqis rejecting what are violent, destabilizing and very distasteful rhetoric, but then holding their noses and voting for the very same politicians who indulge in that rhetoric. So there is a tension, if not a hypocrisy or a kind of schizophrenia there, which is not to say that it's not explainable. Yeah, Iraq went through the most vicious civil war, primarily driven by the collapse of the state and the inability of the state to guard ordinary Iraqis. Now, I used to live in a suburb of Baghdad called Ghazaliya, and when I was living there was a knock on the door, and 3 gentlemen with close cropped hair arrived at the door and said to the guy who owned the house, comrade, we'll look after this street for you. We're protecting our community. He said, that's great. And we just need a bit of money from you in order to get food and weapons. Now, that was a protection racket in any other name, but it provided some level of stability in the street that I lived in. It also was justified in sectarian terms. Now, you could argue the sectarian rhetoric was just instrumental, but it put some kind of explanation beyond the exploitation of money in that. And you could argue, if you were being very cynical, that that's how Iraqi politics works, that the sectarian rhetoric of the politicians is the mask behind which much more, even worse, gratuitous dynamics play. But when given a choice, Iraqis will probably vote for them, depending on the out. And the turnout in the elections is still in the 60s, in the high 60s, I think. And that's, I think, 68% in the provincial elections. So people are still voting, and they're still voting for politicians using sectarian rhetoric.
Jasim, your question, then I think possibly the last one from Nadeem here in the second row.
Yeah, fairly quick questions really about if Maliki wants to, if Hizb al-Da'wah wants to remain in power, do you think Maliki should really allow somebody else to be in his position, like Ali al-Adib and others? Would that save the day for Hizb al-Da'wah? The other things, I noted you have made no mentioning of people like Ja'fari, Muqtada al-Sadr, and al-Hakim. What are their chances in the upcoming elections? But third and the last, really, what should Maliki, how should he have handled the al-Hashimi case? Really, where was the mistake? Thank you.
Maybe a quick one from Nadeem.
Just a quick one. You portrayed quite a negative going forward view. Most of it is based on the premise of a nation state. Why is nation state so important in this context when it was created after the Second World War? without realizing the facts on the ground, either in Syria or in Iraq.
Excellent. Right. Well, four very good questions to end on. On Maliki and the survival of Hizb Dawah, let's see the vote tally. I think if Maliki gets under 89, 85, 80, then Ali Adib, or indeed the independent or quasi-independent Hussein Shahrastani, may well be a powerful alternative that would allow, as we saw in December 2005 when Jafri was removed and Maliki took over, that would allow the dominance of in the state of law or Dawah to remain with Maliki gone. But remember December 2005, the huge amounts of heavy lifting that were needed to get Jafri to take his hands off the levers of power. And with all due respect to the Prime Minister, and I do have a lot of respect for him, I don't think it's the health and continuation of the Dawah party that is upmost in his mind. I think it's his own health and survival as Prime Minister that's upmost in his mind. Now, he may well, and he does frequently say what's best for him is best for Iraq. I don't believe that. I don't think the majority of Iraqis do. But it does depend on the vote tally, which gets back to the point I made earlier. If he is still a very popular politician within his core voting group, and he does get 1 million individual votes in the Baghdad constituency he's running for, and state of law managed to get the largest of the votes, he's going to be very difficult, I suspect, to remove. Now, if we were talent spotting, it's a favourite parlour game in my house, which shows you how interesting we are, about who may be the alternatives. Ali Adib's a good one. I think Shahrastani's a good one. In fact, you can point to any Shia politician with an ounce of ambition. Muwafiq al-Rubai, they gave a very, very long interview to the Iraq Oil Report a month ago, where he basically laid out his platform for Prime Minister. Of course, he didn't say that because he's very loyal at the moment to Nouri al-Maliki, as I would be if I were him at the moment. But he was going into a great deal of policy detail, so you can spot that. But what I would gently suggest, if we take 2005 as an example, is that Maliki is very effectively, as to some extent Jafri did himself, marginalised the capacity of people like Ali Adib to go for him. Yeah? And so it'll be an unknown, like Maliki was, a grey eminence who may come through. Or it could be that the wildcard could be someone like Shahrastani, though I think because of his oil policies and somewhat his quasi-independence, he's not popular enough to do it. Sadr hasn't got a chance. I don't think Jafri's got a chance. I don't think Hakim's got a chance either. That's the three bold statements I may live to regret. Sadr, I don't think, has a chance because he doesn't want the premiership, quite simply, and the Sadrists have already put forward their own candidate for the premiership. But also, as we were saying, the Sadrists' role in post-invasion Iraqi history and their complicity, if not outright backing of a series of bloodshed, would mean a Sadrist premier would be deeply destabilising. I think Jafri's used goods, as it were, his presiding over a chaotic and incoherent Iraqi state in 2005 as Iraq went further into civil war would mean he's not remembered by anyone, probably but himself, with any fondness from his time in government. Hakim, no, again, I think the Supreme Council, although they've done better in the 2013 provincial elections, they're still, I don't think, they're still not popular enough to become a key player, and they're not unpopular enough not to be a threat to the other players. I think either some of them are, or more likely, I suppose, on that basis, a sheer independent within the state of law's wider groupings. How would you handle, how should the Hashemi case have been handled? Well, it depends if there was a case there, doesn't it? If I have bodyguards and they are arrested, and I think 2 of them are tortured to death before they give their confessions, it would suggest to me that their confessions had to be extracted under pain, under great pain, or created, concocted under pain, I would have thought. And then if we move from Hashemi to almost exactly the same allegations with Asawi, there's clearly little or no evidence in the Asawi case, but exactly that same method was used again, the allegations of terrorism as the ultimate allegation to drive. In this case, Hashemi wasn't a popular politician, Asawi was, so I think the judiciary in Iraq is so incoherent, so tainted, and so manipulable that I don't put a great deal of store by either of the way the evidence is raised for either case. How Maliki actually handled it in specifics, charge the man, make sure he's driven from office, and then let him go into exile. You see the same with the former head of the central bank, Shabibi, that it's easier to let people flee the country than to put them on trial in the gaze of publicity. Now, I'm not saying this is the right thing to do in any shape or form, but at least it shows that he has a sense of what's best once he's removed them, let them go and not bring them back. The nation-state question, you're right, my lecture is a very state-centered lecture. But if you and I were to go down to the streets, the suburbs of this very city and ask people who are unhappy what they're unhappy with, they're unhappy with the way the state treats them. They're not calling for succession or a new smaller state. If you travel through most of Iraq for most of the time, things are changing, you find a similar dynamic. Get the people we don't like out of Baghdad, get a more effective group in Baghdad. Where things are changing, obviously where things are profoundly different is in the Kurdish regional government, because obviously of the history of genocide against the Kurds, and also, although a corrupt and somewhat repressive government, a much less corrupt, much less repressive government run by Barzani and the Kurdistan Democratic Party. So you have a smaller government that works, but all around a unitary imagining of an ethnic purity with the Kurdish government. You clearly can't have that down in South Central Iraq. So what I would think what ordinary Iraq is, and ordinary people across the Middle East want, is an effective state that delivers a kind of unitary citizenship. I don't think there's much, if any, call for the breaking up of those states into smaller units yet. That may come in Iraq if things get worse, but I think the nation state, although clearly imported into this area of the world in the 1920s by colonial imposition, since, put a date on it, the 50s, but certainly the 70s, has gained a presence and a loyalty and attachment to the vast majority of the population's lives. So when they call for better, more equal delivery of services to the population as a whole. They don't usually call for secession, which shows that the state has a power and a legitimacy in people's minds.
Well, Toby, thank you very much. Before we all give you a standing ovation as we all rush to leave, I'll just remind everybody that you can buy Toby's book here for the rather generous last price of 10 dinars, I think. But also, if you become a member, you can access Toby's publication and all of our other publications online, which obviously these days are a little bit easier. And you can just ask us for details if you want that. But Toby, thank you so much for coming again. I think this is the fourth or fifth time. I was getting deja vu throughout that presentation, but in an excellent way. So thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your time. And thank you, everybody, for coming here today. Thanks.